Please take your seats. The program will be starting momentarily. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Darkness, the Light, and the Other, our afternoon plenary for Day 2 of the Resnick Aspen Action Forum. To start our program, please welcome Henry Crown Fellow Stephen DeBerry to the stage.
Okay, welcome. I hope everyone had a great lunch and ready for a fantastic session today. My name's Stephen DeBerry. I'm a Henry Crown Fellow, and I realized yesterday that I've been coming here to the Aspen Institute for 20 years now. That was a shock to the system. There are a lot of things I could say about myself. I think I'm a pretty interesting person, but we have someone who is even more interesting than that. And my goal today is to be of service. So I think the highest value thing I can do is get out of the way and facilitate the conversation that we'll have with our guest today. But before I do that, I do want to make one parenthetical note that comes to mind after 2 decades of being here and after participating in every single action forum. I was a fellow before an action forum was a thing. And I noticed that the arc of these action forums is pretty similar each time. On the first day, we all arrive and we're quite polite. There are new people trying to figure out what this Aspen thing is, and people are starting to navigate by which fellowship are you in, and where do you live, and all the standard questions, and everyone's on their good behavior. And then on day 2, people start loosening up a little bit more. There's a little more hugging, maybe some crying in the sessions. Day 3, a little bit more. I'm seeing the heads nodding. You know what I'm talking about. And by the time the parting fiesta happens, all the crying has been happening. People are hugging. They're spilling drinks on each other. It's okay. It's one big happy family. And the reason I talk about that now is because my hope for this session is that we can accelerate that arc. And that after a decade and a half or whatever it's been of doing these action forums, that we cut straight to the chase scene, and that we don't stand on ceremony, and that we actually figure out sooner this week how to love each other, and how to support each other, and how to do the work together. That's the goal. And so my bio for the day, if I can embody it, is that I hope to be a cultural magician to help us get there. That's what I'm trying to do. And so without further delay, what I would like you to do is help me welcome to the stage our special, special guest, Geena Rocero.
Magic, wow. Let's do magic. Hello. Hi, everyone.
It only takes 40 minutes to start a revolution. And they gave us 45. So let's see what we can make happen. Michael Hebb called me, I don't know, a few weeks ago and asked me if I would interview Geena, and instantly I was like, yeah, let's ride. So I want to help introduce Geena. She's a Filipino-born fashion model. She is a TED speaker. She is the founder of Gender Proud. She's a transgender advocate. Things I didn't learn some until today. She's an Emmy award-winning producer. She is a Glamour Woman of the Year.
What?
She is a Playboy Playmate of the Year.
What?
I know, right?
Keep going.
She's spoken at the United Nations headquarters, the World Economic Forum, the White House, so much more. But most importantly, to me, Geena is my friend and a person that I love dearly. So Geena, welcome. Really happy to have you.
Thank you.
And you know, I had a call after I agreed to do this session with Geena, and in my mind, you know, I went into that conversation saying, okay, well, we're gonna have this amazing conversation with this transgender powerhouse. And so I went into that conversation with the transgender frame in my mind. And one of the first surprises for me in the dialogue that we had was that we didn't talk about that. I don't think that word was uttered. But the word that was uttered many times was liberation. And so I wonder if you would just say a word or two about that.
Sure. Thank you again. I think, no, it's funny, you know, when we first had that conversation, you know, for me, I think there's a tendency, you know, yes, you know, a lot of people know me as advocating for trans rights, the first trans this, all that, you know, there's a tendency to put a box in that identity, right? And I talk about liberation as a framework for who I am as a person, as who I am as a spiritual being, who I am as a Filipina, who I am as an immigrant. You know, I think those kind of frameworks and liberation for me, and particularly using transness as a way for me to understand the world, because the world would see transness as this other thing, as this other identity. I think in my journey, I really begin to really see it and more so talk about it in a sense for people to understand what, you know, transness stands for. More so as in this current environment where conversations of dehumanization of trans folks, I know to be that in my journey, I believe that trans people represent freedom. Freedom in a world that's been led to believe that gender is just this very rigid binary, that transness, gender nonconformity offers that freedom for people to understand that it could be those things, right? It could be a spectrum. You know, we're having conversations around about like potentially our first female president, you know, like it's part of that root cause, because for so long we operated in a world where it's just this very rigid binary. You know, you see a baby in an ultrasound and we identify it by genitalia, and we identified a very rigid, limiting framework of how that being would live. So I say all that because I really see the spiritual journey of trans folks and gender nonconforming folks, not just in current, modern, contemporary zeitgeist, but more so from really long history of transness, from pre-colonial. You know, I talk about, you know, such a proud Filipino, and while saying that, it's also signifying that I'm also speaking about, like, it is a country that's been colonized multiple times over. So I carry that with me, and I use that journey as a source of strength for me.
Mm-hmm. And talk to us a little bit about that colonial history and the relationship between these binaries that we find ourselves with now and your heritage as a Filipino human being and your current identity.
You know, for so many people, I think, you know, we're definitely seeing more and more of, you know, trans conversation in the zeitgeist, in TV and magazines and all that. I might be in one of those covers, you know. For so many people, it's their first interaction, right? The media representation is what we see. But, you know, trans folks have been around since the beginning of time. You know, in my own journey, I'm decolonizing my mind. That's when I first really looked within that long history. That even in the Philippines, we have 100-something dialects. We have, you know, one of our main language, Tagalog. We don't even have he or she on our pronoun. It's a gender-neutral language. And Tagalog is just part of this, I'm gonna go geek out anthropologist here, because I am a closet anthropologist. You know, even, you know, Philippines Tagalog is part of this Austronesian language family that spans all over the Pacific, New Zealand, Aotearoa, Hawaii, all the way to Madagascar, Rapa Nui, Indonesia, southern Thailand. That group of like language family that consists of about 1,200 languages, most of those languages doesn't have he or she. It's gender neutral. Because the ethos of pre-colonial identities, not just in the Philippines, but all over the world, did not operate in this thing called gender binary. So for me, who I am now as an artist, as a storyteller, but more so, you know, how I move around the world, you know, that knowledge of pre-colonial richness and history and sense of pride and sense of beauty and resilience, you know, that carries me forward, and that's my motivation in all that I do.
I love that, and you know, I've known Geena for years, and it wasn't until we worked on this project that I realized your love for language. I am a linguistic anthropologist by training.
We were like, what? Perfect.
Yeah, I'm like, who?
Talk about magical coincidence already. It's meant to be.
And it's true. So Austronesian languages, about 400 million people in the world who speak them. And one of the folks who trained me focused on American Samoa. And there's a not dissimilar phenomenon there where there are language constructs there where you might say, like, you know, you're riding a bus and the guy swerves around a, you know, pig walking on the road. You say like, malo le fauli means like, that's good driving. You did a good job driving. In the way the language is constructed, you can't, it's kind of like the concept of Ubuntu, right, philosophically. You can't have a driver or a teacher without a passenger or a student. It's just embedded into the language construct. And it's fascinating that the language doesn't have these kinds of pronouns that we struggle with.
So it's
here.
actually weird. When I first moved to America, and people used to shame me and make fun of me when I would confuse, you know, I'm speaking American language, he, she. And people used to make fun of me, you're using the wrong pronoun. And for so long, I would take that in, like, oh, I don't know the right language. But I think now my relationship with that is like my ancestors telling me, we've always known. You know, indigenous people have always known, right? And not just in the Pacific Islands, not just in Austronesian language family, like in this very country, Native American cultures have always known the variety of genders, not just in this rigid identity. So I think, you know, going back to the framework of liberation, for me to understand that that's what it is, you know, and not just in language, but our way of being, our, you know, indigenous identities in the Philippines. We used to, you know, we're primarily animist culture in the Philippines before we were colonized, you know, by Spain for 400 years and then America for 50 years. We used to pray to trans goddesses. And I have a tattoo called Lakapati here, which is basically like transgender goddess of fertility and golden rise. Like the people pray to deities, you know, the transgender goddess of compassion in Buddhism, Guanyin, is considered gender fluid. You know, and the mythology in India, Hijra, Bahuchara Mata, it exists in every culture. So this is nothing new.
So, I mean, you can recite this so beautifully and easily now, but you didn't always have that.
Yeah.
How did you come to reconnect with these kinds of roots?
You know, it's funny. When I first moved to America, and I talked about this when I wrote my book, Horse Barbie, it's one of those things that people have asked me, what were you most afraid to talk about? I wasn't afraid to talk about my transgender journey because, in the Philippines, that we have a very vibrant transgender culture in the mainstream sense. The thing I was most afraid to talk about was my journey in decolonizing my mind, because I felt like if I start talking about it, I feel like I'm more so directly challenging my mom, my grandmother, my auntie. Like, it's like that kind of knowledge that they were taught. To challenge that is the big disrespect. But it was also my truth. It is the truth. And sometimes it saddens me to think about that I had to leave the motherland in order for me to really get to know the motherland. Because in the Philippines, it's still the case in many, in all aspects of life in the Philippines, it's still in a very colonial mindset. We still say, when you go to a museum in the Philippines, you could still normally hear, when Ferdinand Magellan discovered Philippines in 1521. It's still rooted in that. So in my journey to get there, when I first moved to America, I was 18 years old. I remember the very first time, somebody told me, we're gonna go to a tanning salon. And I was like, what do you mean tanning salon? And it's like, and then we went to this place in San Francisco, and this woman asked me, it's like, how dark do you want to be? When she asked me that question, I was like, what? People are choosing to, for pleasure, whatever, for novelty, whatever, access to, because they could do it. It was a revelation for me, because in the Philippines, the lighter the skin, the better you are. The proximity to white supremacist ideals in the Philippines is the norm. So that was a revelation for me, just that thought process of, to be ashamed of, Philippines is in a tropical country, but people want to bleach their skin. You could literally follow a starting actor in the Philippines and the trajectory, how light their skin gets in all their advertising. They do injections to lighten the skin. It's the proximity to that ideal that have poisoned the minds of sense of pride from Filipinos. And if you've traveled in other places in Asia, this also exists, right? And that's the insidious ways of colonial understanding that erases a sense of pride and beauty. So when I first had that revelation, that's when I really began to read books. And I began to read books, and then that's, it really fed my curiosity. And, I say I'm a closet anthropologist, and, read books about how trans people played a central role in pre-colonial Philippines. Before we were colonized, we have 7,000 islands in the Philippines, so you could imagine the multiple nations and kingdoms in the Philippines. So in each of those islands, the spiritual healer in each of those islands that advises the kings and queens are trans people. We were the guide towards magic, towards what was possible, to the divine, The divinity of trans people were so present. It's present in our current language right now. So you could just imagine when the first missionary in 1521 got there, right? But remembering that from me, it gives me a sense of pride, because the erasure in that value system and that spiritual way to be connected to who we truly are, was almost erased. Yeah. So that gives me, sense of pride.
Yeah, it's powerful to realize that it's nearly erased, but somehow it always finds a way to persist.
Yeah.
And that persistence, blossoms in the form of these cultural contradictions that emerge, right? So like, we don't like brown folks, but we got these tannin boots, and in your book, which is fantastic, I think there are cards on all the tables about Horse Barbie, definitely worth a read. You talk about your experience with this club. Was it Divas?
Divas.
Yeah. I'd love for you to say a word about that.
Yeah. So, I talk about this in the book, that when I first moved to America at 17 years old, It was a complete culture shock, in a completely different place. But I just want to take a little further before that because that was a major point in the place in Divas. In the Philippines, we have this very mainstream culture of transgender beauty pageants. We are so Catholic in the Philippines, we don't even have divorce. The only country in the world where you can get divorced. However, but during our fiesta celebration, which happens throughout the Philippines throughout the year, a 5-day celebration to celebrate, for example, St. Peter, right? 5-day celebration. On the 5th day, the main event that usually falls on a Sunday, the main event is a transgender beauty pageant. And and usually it's funded by the government. And if it's organized by the local community, the pageant stage is literally right in front of the church. And our dressing rooms is inside the church. So you could imagine us being all looking up to all the saints. So there's that. But the contradiction is what you're alluding to is, I'd like to say that trans people in the Philippines are culturally visible, but we're not politically recognized. To this day, there are no rights for trans people in the Philippines. To this day, I can't change my name and gender marker on my legal documents. If I still have my Philippine passport, I would still have an M on my gender marker. It's basically existing every day of your life, not who you are. I like to say trans people in the Philippines are legally erased. So when I moved to America, when my mom, who's the Shira of my story, when she told me, she was living in San Francisco, she told me, your petition process came through, but if you move to America, you could actually be legally recognized as a woman. You could have F on your gender marker. So when I moved here, I was like, what? For her to say that as if she was speaking magic, because still to this day, it's not possible in the Philippines. So when I moved to United States in San Francisco, I have an F on my gender marker, but my first question to my mom was like, where are the transgender beauty pageants? Like, there is no such thing. And then, 18 years old, I started going to these clubs, and then I started going to this place, what Stephen was alluding to, Divas, where it's a place where men who love trans women would go to. So, yes, I'm not 21 yet. I was not supposed to be there, but I was there. Don't tell my mom. And that was the first sense of feeling desired, a sense of feeling a safe space. Because the fact that we have this very mainstream cultural visibility in the Philippines, like our trans beauty pageants in the Philippines are shown on national television. When you go to church on Sunday, 1 p.m., everybody goes home, the whole family watches a trans beauty pageant, right?
So it's like NFL.
We consider it's a national sport. No, it is a national sport,
Is there like fantasy pageant?
I mean, it's full on, yeah. And then when I first moved to America, the very first representation of trans people that I saw on national television was on Jerry Springer. That there. Imagine how I felt, like what? And that was the beginning of shame, that in some places, that in America, the way they see transness or otherness, or when you're going outside the supposed gender binary, you're considered something to be ashamed of, something to be othered, and it was another revelation for me, and I had to grapple with that because in a sense that, yes, my mom I love my mom so much, and she gave me this opportunity to see beyond what was possible in my life, to have an F, to be legally recognized as the woman that I am. I was sold this promise of freedom in America, literally the F as a freedom, but when I moved here, I got shamed. And that, it was the beginning of that shame. I never thought I would be able to be that pageant queen in the Philippines, because when I was 15 years old, I started joining all these pageants in the Philippines, became the most famous transgender beauty queen. I'm a pageant diva. That's a polite way of saying I've won them all. So what would I do with that, in America that doesn't have that culture?
Yeah. It's troubling to say the least, the way that we hold that kind of space. and you used this word shame, which is so powerful. And part of what makes it so challenging to be your full self as a trans person. And we talked a little bit about the, not just discomfort, but the actual danger of coming out and being who you are publicly. You know, in the United States, for young trans people, there is an attempted suicide every 45 seconds. So I'm not sure how many young people we have in the youth program. Is it probably, I don't know, 50-ish? Something like that? 90? Okay, imagine if half of them, many of them are not here. We love all of them. These are our kids. Imagine if half of them just didn't come back after this session. That's what's happening right now. And so we've got to figure out how to hold all of our kids, because they are our kids, and none of them are disposable. So, I mean, those are seemingly insurmountable forces against you being who you are. And still, you made the decision to push forward and be that.
Yeah.
And not only that, but to do it in such a fabulous way. So how did you even do that? Like, that's a magic trick into itself.
I mean, I've mentioned about my mom, and I really, you know, I felt like I wouldn't be able to do the work that I do without that immediate love and support of my mom, my dad also specifically. And even them are operating in this. My mom is a devout Catholic woman who loves her trans daughter. There's no but there. And my dad is this very machismo guy who also loved his trans daughter. So I think having that early support in the family allowed me, because it's already messed up when you go outside your family unit. So to have that initial support and love that allowed me to be who I am. I was also the baby in the family, so maybe it allowed me to do whatever I want. But because I have that love, I'm able to, yes, I have to deal with the other things in the world. And I think, you know, what you were saying when we first met at TED, prior to that, I moved from San Francisco, I moved to New York City, you know, to pursue a fashion career. I moved to New York in 2005, and this is a very different time. So when I moved there, I made the decision to not share about my trans identity. For 8 years, my model agent did not know I was transgender. So.
And at what risk? I mean, talk about.
I mean, because,
like, what was
you know,
at stake?
it was so many trans fashion models that came before me. They were working as fashion models, and the moment they got out there, their careers disappeared as if they did not exist. And it's usually from someone they know, an off-the-cuff comment, somebody sold a story. And usually when that happens, it's usually in a tabloid publication, which is the most dehumanizing thing one could experience. So for me, existing for 8 years in New York City, I was, you know, I joke about this now, and sometimes I think like why I love the spy genre, because I felt like I was a spy in a clandestine operation for 8 years. You know, I was visible and invisible at the same time. You cannot be more visible in fashion industry, advertising, commercial. I don't know why I chose that field, but I wanted to be there. So to manage that complexity that, yes, this is my dream. Yes, I'm pursuing my dream. I was a successful fashion model, but whenever I'm at home, I have to deal with that shame. I have to deal with, when is somebody gonna say something? When is that phone call from my model agent to say, hey, New York Post says that, you know, this thing that they're about to release. You know, there was a constant fear of having to figure out, but I knew I had that drive to pursue that dream. So, but I also have to say, it got to the point where it got really dark. Let me just say that. And on my 30th birthday, I was entering, you know, in my 30s, and it just felt like I got really sick. I had intense eczema all over my body. that at one point my dermatologist thought I had scabies. Sorry, but it was really that. It was all over my body. I thought that I would never be able to wear a swimsuit again. There's still some marks here and there. And I realized after consulting people, because I was about to enter in my 30s, and I figured I cannot enter in this new decade in my life with this shame, with this pain and this fear. So I decided if I'm going to risk, to share for the first time in my industry in the world, that I want to do it in the biggest stage. I'm not a stranger to a stage in pageant world. I've been in a Coliseum and 20,000 people, or a pageant next to a street. I wanted to do it because I felt like there was a sense of purpose that was so much bigger than my fear. So I wanted to come out and share my story on a TED stage, a TED conference where we first met in 2014. And little did I know, 2014 was the beginning of this cultural zeitgeist of trans conversation. And Time Magazine, my TED Talk, I believe, came out in March 2014. And June that year, Time Magazine with dear sister Laverne Cox on the cover of Transgender Tipping Point, But because of that as well, in our community, we're having conversation of what tipping point? Because there are visible trans people, all of a sudden everything is solved. And what you're alluding to and the dangers and the threat is that since 2014, if the mainstream zeitgeist is considering this tipping point, it's also the most dangerous for trans folks. Since 2014, the data, it's going up every year. Trans people being murdered for who we are, not just in the United States, all over the world. So for trans folks existing, particularly in the American context, when we, and there are conversations obviously in the activist space, yes, it's also related to marriage equality that people used to talk about, just come out, be visible and things will be okay. For trans and gender nonconforming folks, aggravated even more so if you're a trans person of color, when we decide to be who we are, we usually get killed. We usually experience violence. So what does that do? How does it reflect to society, particularly in American context that's obsessed to visibility? There are limits to visibility, You mentioned a sobering statistic. I know that that's been thrown out there, and I know with my relationship in my community, the average life expectancy of a trans woman of color is 35 years old in the United States. So the threat and the fear that you're saying, for me, there's a tendency that because I had that love from my family, if I too succumb to that fear, who am I? Who I really am? And I know because I'm lucky to have had that love and support of my community and the trans family that I have in the Philippines, that I dare to exist in the most unapologetic self in all the things that I do, because why not? Why not? The biggest advocacy that I could do is to live unapologetically in all the essence of who I am.
I love that. What is that about, the fear? What are people afraid of?
Just gave me crazy goosebumps. I think the first thing that came up is, when people hear the story, and people, yes, I understand people say, oh, you're so courageous, you're being authentic, and I take that. There's also this sense, especially in this current social-political context that we're having, the attacks on trans lives all over America, in all of political system, in all of the policy, that the people that are passing those policies basically does not want us to exist as trans folks, as gender non-conforming folks. Kids just wants to play, And when people ask me within that sort of thread of questioning, yes, I could deconstruct the policy and all that. I think what I'm really interested when I talk about this is to think about it in the sense that I think the people that are hating, the people that are harboring this fear and hate, I think what they're most afraid about is their own truth. Because I think what trans people represent is freedom, as what we talked about earlier. In a world that doesn't create a space for us to exist as trans folks, but we still choose every day to exist because this is our truth, there's nothing more courageous than that. And in the sense that for people that's been, as I mentioned earlier, in societal context has been led to believe of this gender as this very rigid binary, to challenge that belief system. And what I'm saying that hopefully what they see is what we represent as freedom. I think that mirror is held back to them, that who they are without that fear, right? Because the fear that they have exists within the limits of of the story and the myth that they told about themselves. One other thing that, a lot of people that are against, the beauty and freedom of trans people, is they always say it's unnatural, it's against the natural law. In my geek anthropological self, it is the most natural thing to be as a trans folks. Gender fluidity exists in every mammalian species, in every species, in birds. I like telling this story that I spoke at the headquarters of Pixar, and during the Q&A, they said something, what's the dream, Geena? What's the next dream? And I told them, it's like, my next dream, I want Pixar to say that Nemo is trans. Because the species of clownfish is trans. I mean, obviously they didn't talk about that, but clownfish, the matriarch, right, the character, the matriarch in clownfish, when she dies, the next senior male becomes female. Transness and fluidity exists in every single natural system, in every species. So the fear that you're saying is rooted from this mythology of these stories that we've been told, in all of our lives, especially in American context. And I think the other point I want to say is that the fear also happens because, in America, I think what trans folks represent is to deal with the history and the mythology of this country, right? Because if you begin to accept that gender is fluid and it's part of, everyday existence, that it's the most natural thing, that is also part of indigenous culture, American culture would have to grapple with its own history, how this country was founded on, because gender fluidity exists in Native American culture. So, and that's a lot of work. Yeah. That's a lot of unpacking. That's a lot of ego dissolution, Yeah. But I believe that's the work, because to move forward, I think it gives us that sense of compassion and healing in the world, especially that in so much pain right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. I didn't know about the Nemo thing. Yeah. And it's really interesting because there is a class of animals that are called philopatric. Yeah. Which technically means love of country, but the way I describe it is these are animals. I learned this initially because I'm an avid fisherman. So salmon are philopatric, turtles, butterflies. So philopatria is basically, the way I would describe it, is when you know how to get home, even though you've never been there. So monarch butterflies, for example, when they migrate from Canada to Mexico, the butterflies that arrive in Mexico are the third generation of butterflies that have taken that journey. They've never been there. How do they know where to go? But they get there every year, after year, after year. And so I've got to believe that if this is true for many different animals, we've got to have
Oh,
that
it's
kind
true.
of knowing
It's definitely true.
in ourselves. But the challenge is we have all these blockers, right? And so
Yeah.
we're talking about othering, and I think when the othering conversation comes up, what often the word that comes up is difference. But there's space between difference and othering. How do you think about that difference?
I like that word because, I was literally talking about the animal kingdom. You know, there are the variety of species and diversity. Like, I think difference is seen as an asset, it should be, because we're all different, but we're all the same in our needs and wants, right? We all want the same things, to be seen, to be affirmed, to dream our love of our family. So we have different experiences, different points of view. I think the othering, there's a different power in that. And it's about the gaze on who's using that word and how that gets projected out into the world in our own spheres of life.
And
in
to
our
what
family,
end, maybe?
in our immediate community, and to what end? So
Yeah.
I think I like the distinction in that, because differences should be celebrated, because the natural world, as we are surrounded here, right? I mean, the variety of things. And I think gender identity and gender fluidity is connected to that. It should be seen as the most natural thing as part of that. And the othering is the proximity to how that power is being used, and how whoever is othering creates that power.
Yeah.
And that power, I said sad. The
Yeah.
othering, it's as simple as that.
I mean, it seems like it's a mechanism to stoke fear
Yeah.
in an attempt to consolidate power. So I think about which makes it easier to activate in marginalized and particularly smaller populations. I think about the population of Jews in Nazi Germany, about 1% of the population in Germany at the time. I think about the population of our trans population in the US right now. I'm not sure what it looks like globally, but in the US, it's about 1%. So
The ones that we know of.
yeah, that's right. Yeah. But it makes it an easier target to stoke fear in others and consolidate power. And so, maybe the antidote to that is what you've exhibited, which is the courage to be yourself. So I want to do a little experiment here. I haven't done this one before, but I want you all to see the beauty in my friend here, the way I do. And yes, glamour, girl, and playboy, and all that. There's this to me, I mean, you're my homie, you're my girl. Like, you're beautiful, but there's a weirdness in that, because there's also this objectification on some levels, and the pageantry, and this. I don't know. There's
Depending on the gaze, though.
Depending on the gaze, but on some levels, there's this performative aspect, and that these are not the. I see a beauty in you that's beyond that. So I want to do an experiment, if you would trust me.
Okay.
In front of all these people, I would love for you to close your eyes. You cool with that?
Okay, let's.
I would love for you to just close your eyes and go inward. Because that's where I see you. And that's where I see you blossom. I see the fullness of your power and your beauty. It's not your physical presentation. And what I want to be is you're a model. I want you to model your emotional self. I want you to model the power that got you to the place where, despite all of the risks and challenges and ridicule, you still knew how to get home, even though you hadn't been there yet. You found the way to get there. I want you to model that. So I want you to talk to us about what it felt like. How did it feel when you got home, when you got to a place where you could finally, fully say, this is me? What does that feel like?
You know, I think what's coming up for me is, a place of joy, the full expression of joy and uninterrupted joy. And the thing that's coming up for me is I'm in a music festival in the woods, I'm late, surrounded, like I'm imagining sunset glimmering in the water, and I'm dancing, sweating, just the smile that's all the way up to my ear, and
That's what's happening. What does it feel like in
and
your body?
it feels a sense of everything is possible. It's a sense of when I'm dancing, when I'm in the music festival, I feel healed, and carrying the things that I've been through. And because we talk about, like, somehow what's coming up is my pre-colonial indigenous ancestors, talking to me. I'm probably also under some psychedelics, And to access that spiritual realm while I'm dancing, I feel like I'm talking to my pre-colonial indigenous ancestors and telling me that you're good, you're enough, This spiritual conversation that we're having is, it keep doing it, keep remembering it, because when I would feel that uncontrollable emotion of dancing, my hand is up, dancing, I'm sweating. I just want to continue that, because I think that's a place where, despite all the things that I've gone through, joy for me, the fullness of it, is my way forward.
Yeah, thank you. I love that. Thank you for sharing that, Geena. It's inspiring to witness you experience that kind of freedom and liberation. And I think about what it would take for all of us to experience that, And I think about what the conditions might be. I think it has to do with something. You mentioned the word affirmed, but I think it has something to do with being accepted without guilt, condition, or delay. Like right now, you are okay as you are, fully. I think that's the foundation of it. I think it has something to do with being held in confidence, and that means confidentiality, which is something we do well here at Aspen. But I also think it means the trust to say, I am trusting you to hold my full self here, and I may not be ready to do that outside of this space, but we can start right here, and I can trust you to hold that at the level of expansion that I'm comfortable with, and at the pace that I'm comfortable with. And finally, that the people with whom you share in that way are an accomplice to your journey. And so that means that when you share, I don't try to steer you, that's your job. When you share, what I do is I get behind and push. And it's a work in progress as a thought, but I just wonder if those are the conditions that could get us all there. And if they're not, what do they need to be so that we can all get there? And I especially wonder, going back to what I was saying at the beginning about trying to accelerate the arc that we find ourselves on at these action forums, how do we get there? How do we get to the full appreciation and acceptance of self? not Thursday night, but tonight. Because I think that would be a revolution for this community. And I think that's, it's a fractal that would repeat out into the world. So I'm gonna do one more experiment. I know we're over time by some seconds. It just says 0, so we got time. But I want to do one more experiment, if you all would indulge me. And that is, I want to invite you to a quick little journey into yourselves as well. And if you're comfortable, I would love it if you would just close your eyes for a second, everybody. And I think I'm the only one, except for the 3 of y'all over there, that has their eyes open. And so I think you can feel safe. And what I want to do is invite you, like Geena just modeled for us, to go into yourself. And the question is, where's your space of unbridled acceptance? What's the corner of you that you've been holding back? You don't bring into the seminar room. Maybe you don't talk to your family about. Maybe you're not fully honest with yourself about facing. And I wonder if you could just open the space to that corner of yourself and feel some warmth in that space. Experience some light in that space. And feel the joy of that complete, unedited embrace of who you are. And then in feeling that and in rejoicing in that, if you would have the courage and the trust and the love to bring that corner of yourself to the spaces that we occupy for the rest of this action forum. Come on back. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming. Thank you, Geena, for being such a great leader for us. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And now, to close our afternoon plenary, please welcome to the stage philosopher, writer, activist, professor, and founder of the Emergence Network, Bayo Akomolafe.
Keep clapping. Thank you so much. I'm still recovering from Geena's. Geena, where's Geena? Geena, hey, just come all the way. Come all the way. Let's give a hug. I'd like us to do something real quick. There's something Geena was speaking about that I heard as an invitation to consider that the colonial is the quest for the categorical, right? What the colonial does is to try to reduce tensions and intensities into a stable, neat snapshot of an identity. And that's what coloniality does. It thinks in binaries. But our bodies do not think in binaries. Our bodies think in the lowercase, not the uppercase, right? Our bodies are constantly fluid, moving through the world. I want to invite us to do something to memorialize and mark this moment. I want to also say that the opposite of trans isn't straight, okay? The opposite of trans isn't straight. Trans is the disruption of binaries altogether, right? It's not like, here, I'm trans and I'm straight. That's the proliferation of what modernity knows how to do best. And that's not what we're about here now. We're about to notice that our bodies are fluid becomings. Our bodies are fugitive. Our bodies are transgressions of binaries. In the ritual, in the spirit of that idea that we are moving and we're never quite captured, as we often think we are, I'd like everyone to stand to their feet. If you can stand to your feet. If you can stand to your feet, please stand to your feet. I was introduced just now by the voice of God. Where's my brother? Voice of God. Could you just, yeah. I'm sorry about what I said to you. Just before we were doing some testing, and I told him, well, you're not Morgan Freeman yet, and there's still some way to go. But I'd like you, brother, to announce, to invite everyone to go around and hug in the voice of God mode, okay? You're not doing it as yourself, your voice of God, okay? All right. Scene, okay? So you're inviting everyone to go hug someone else, right? To practicalize and ritualize the idea that you are not completely yourself all by yourself. We need and we breathe through each other. That is the most emancipatory, liberatory thesis that could upset white modernity. That we live through each other. So, brother, it's your turn, okay? Voice of God, okay?
And now, I invite you all to hug someone else.
There's always someone to hug. Just look. Voice of God, could you tell everyone to stop now?
Please take your
I have
seats.
just this amount of time, okay? All righty then. Thank you. How did that feel, people? Good? Yeah, do it. Thank you for being playful and for being game for those explorations of the porous, the yet to come. My name is Bayo. You might have heard of me before. I was in Aspen last year, and it has been wonderful to come back this time, especially in this week. This week has been politically, cosmically consequential, right? Right? If you know what I'm talking about, just raise your hands in the air and wave them like you just don't care. Really consequential. Monday was the hottest day of the unrecorded history. Monday, just Monday, was the hottest day in recorded history, according to people who study that kind of stuff. I was landing in Aspen on the 21st, so that was Sunday, a day before. And we landed in Aspen. I put on my phone, as it seemed everyone else did the same, and I saw, I'm not a Twitter, what's it called now, X, right? I'm not an Twitter guy, I don't post, but it seems to be a consequential source of news these days. So I went to Twitter/X, and there was this huge seismic news. You know what I'm talking about, right? We can all say it together. The Nigerian, what are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. What I know, they should have told you about me by now. The Nigerian youth are gathering to protest bad governance on August 1st. Okay? Which is fascinating news, right? If you know anything about what's happening on the continent of Africa, you might understand that the continent is sitting on a powder keg right now. Kenya is explosive. right? And the youth in Kenya have inspired protests in Uganda and in Ghana and in Nigeria. It seems everywhere there are conversations about bad governance and a desire for more, right? I scrolled very quickly to see what I scrolled past news about unidentified aerial phenomenon and news about who's the best rapper and news about some president refusing to or deciding not to run for a second term. But I passed all this marginal stuff behind, and I got to this news. Very, very fascinating stories about what might yet be. I get it, okay? I went to the second seemingly important news about President Biden and his decision not to run for a second term, to stop and end his campaign. And of course, I understand there was this huge eruption of energy and excitement that I feel most of us are feeling in this room, right? I think reports are that Kamala Harris broke the funding record, the 24-hour funding record, to the tune of how much, people? 100 million? Was it 100 million? I heard it was 81 million, so just a few private jets down the line. So 81 million, 100 million, she broke it. And everyone is excited, right? There's funding goals broken. People are galvanized. They're like breathing enough, air again. And everyone is saying, yes, finally we get to stop the imperial march of fascism. And we can end it in its tracks. And maybe that's why we're here. It's this premise that light might win. If we only give it a little bit of illumination, if we stay with the light, we might win. We might end darkness. That's the very stuff of this, the thesis of this gathering. It's Martin Luther King. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. But you see, my mind is trained to be suspicious of victory, to be a little bit hesitant about claims to exclusivity or to arrival or to stability or to settlement. I've been called different names. I'm a public intellectual. I've been called different kind of names about the kinds of things that I think about. But you see, that doesn't faze me because I feel my vocation is the vocation of the trickster. And I think along the archetype of the trickster. I think with the trickster. And so I started to think about the protests and these eruptions of joy and victory and proclamations of arrival, and wonder what that obscures. I wonder what that elides. Wonder what is lost in our declarations of arrival. And so I want to say this about that whole thing that is still happening right now, and which we all learn as a story. We're learned and trained to think about it as the hero's journey. Does anyone know here the hero's journey, the myth of the hero's journey? If you've watched any Disney flick, including Nemo, right? What's that one again called? Finding Nemo. Hey, Dart. If you've watched that one, if you watched anything, if you watched Lord of the Rings, the story stands true. A hero is called out from trouble, and then the hero descends into darkness and defeats a monster. There's always a conveniently located monster just at the tip of the hero's blade, right? Like, oh, I'm sorry, I came late. Okay, this is the point where you kill me. And the hero kills the monster, and the hero comes out with a lesson, with victory, and announces his arrival. And that's how we think about the world. It's the myth of the hero's journey. I've been thinking about the monster's journey lately. And all the carcasses of monsters that have made ecologies for the victories of heroes. But more importantly, I want to say this, with great respect to Martin Luther King, to the great Martin Luther King. It seems if we stay with a careful consideration of history, with the way that the world upsets binary formulations, then it's not quite the case that light chases out darkness. There seems to be something queer here. And I want to tell you this story. It's a quick story. It happened in 1818. I'm a history kind of guy. I'm also a diva, but I'm a nerd kind of diva. You know, the one that's boring, you know. But I'm a nerd, and nerds are divas in their own right. Nerd life matters, you know. Okay, so in 1818, all right? In 1818, I think it was in 1815 that a certain conqueror was conquered, and the royalists were in retreat. The French Academy of Sciences put out this call for a competition. There was a competition, and if you had some brilliant thesis about how physics works, about how the world works, you could submit a paper. There was this young man called Augustin Fresnel, and Fresnel had an idea that was not too popular. To physicists in the house, I'm just a psychologist, so don't beat me up on the details, okay? And I'm a recovering psychologist at that, so. Fresnel had an idea, and the idea was this, that if we actually take a good look at light, it doesn't behave like particles. You see, the huge contest was between people who thought that light was just a bunch of particulate matter, right? Anytime you put on the light, it streams forth this burst of particles and ball-like things, right? So light is corpuscular, it's particulate. The other end of the spectrum, so to speak, was, you know, Fresnel and some others, Christopher Huygens, that felt, no, light is a wave. Light is not corpuscular, it's a wave, you see. Of course, the people who felt that light was particulate were winning the argument. They were the establishment. Fresnel felt he had a way to prove once and for all that light behaves more like waves. And so he wrote this beautiful thesis, and he took it to his mentor. His mentor's name was Arago, Francois Arago. And Arago believed that light was particulate, but he loved his student. And so he encouraged him and said, do something about this. Submit this paper to the academy. Let's see what happens. And so they took this paper and they took it to a panel. Has anyone here presented before a PhD panel? Okay. Are you recovering from this experience? I've sat in panels before, and I've been the subject of panels, so I know how frightening it is. And Fresnel came with his paper, and all these old white men sitting there stared at Fresnel and said, this is absurd. This is irresponsible. No one thinks like this. This is horrible. You shouldn't bring this kind of stuff to a reputable Academy of Sciences like this. And then a man called Simeon Poisson, who is the subject of my story, and many stories I shall tell henceforth. In fact, I'm writing about him in my new book. Poisson said, you know what, I'm going to prove to you how absurd your story is. And so he studied the paper. And then he came back to the panel with Fresnel and said, see, look, if your story is actually true, then if we take a little ball, a perfectly spherical shape, and point a coherent source of light on it, then the shadow that it casts should have a little glimmer of light in the center of the shadow, which is horrible to think about because that's not how shadows work. Shadows are the exclusion of light. You can't have light in shadows, can you, people? I ask you, can you have light inside shadows? Anyone here? For $50,000, who can answer this question? Dar will provide the right? Not me. You're not coming to the Global South for that. Dar will provide that. For $50,000, what's the answer to the question? If you point a coherent source of light at a spherical shape, the shadow will cast, the shadow that's cast will have a little ball of light in fact, the brightest part of a shadow is its center. Is that true or not? $20,000? $10,000? I'll tell you what happened, just to get to the point. So everyone laughed it off, and it was supposed to be the end of the panel. But Arago said, why not we just test it? I thought this was the whole premise of science. Let's see what happens. And so he tested it. Turns out it's true. If you cast light that way on a shape that's perfectly circular, you don't see this every day because we don't have perfectly spherical shapes around us every day. But if you cast a coherent source of light on a spherical shape, you will get a small center of light in the shadow. You know what that spot is called? Poisson spot. It's named after the person who said it was impossible. Which goes to show that even your mistakes, your greatest mistakes, could live on in your name, right? There are many other names for it. Fresnel spot, Arago spot, Poisson spot is the one that sticks with me. But whatever you name it, I think there's something of an idea here that disrupts the way we think about morality, the way I've just talked about an example from optics. But I think it extrapolates into the field of morality, how we think about ourselves. We're grown into ecologies that teach us to think that, to borrow from Geena, to think in binaries. It's light versus dark. It's light versus shadows. It is good versus evil. It is the hero versus the monster. We are trained to think about the world in this way, where we practice it all the time. But as a member of the Global South, I come to you with a thesis. You don't have to accept it. But that as a recipient of righteousness from the Global North, I'm tired of goodness. I'm tired of your goodness. I'm tired of your righteousness. Because it's not really working. Good people. Are you good? How many of you are good people? I mean, you don't have to answer that question. As a psychologist, I ask crazy questions. But I want you to sit with that idea. A strange idea that, yes, darkness drives out darkness. No, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. But light and darkness are stranger than we can think. That the world is stranger than those binaries that we execute. And in many senses, I think that morality, instead of just this isolated, transcendent field where preternaturally good people are in conversation with preternaturally evil people on the other side of the spectrum, we are learning that sometimes even being good can be complicit in the reinforcement of oppressive systems. That being good or being evil, sometimes, when you think about morality as a material, not just a transcendent imposition of rules that our conscience picks up in the air. If you think about morality as a field that stretches, that it can be exhausted sometimes, then sometimes even light can be a burning sunlight that can have fascist effects. There's this beautiful proverb that says, light all the time gives birth to a desert. There's something about our predisposition to seeing the world in those neat categoricities that obscures the other ways that we're being invited to act and be intentional. Let me just speak about that a little more. I feel that as a species, gestating in nation-state systems, we are stuck. There's a lot of things we want to address, and I think many of those reasons are why we're here today, why we've traveled all the way to Aspen to have these conversations. There are many things we want to address: climate change, racial injustice, pandemics, the decline of trust in democratic institutions. We all want to solve these problems. Many of you, for instance, and I give these examples all the time, many of you are very, very careful about how you throw away your trash. I've just become the W.E.B. Du Bois Scholar in Residence at the Schumacher Center for a New Economics, also taking up a visiting professorship at Clark University. I'm now living in the United States for a couple of months. My Americanisms are increasing. I hike now. And when I hike, I tell people on the way down from hiking that it's worth it. So the other day I told people, I was speaking online and I uttered the word soccer. I apologize to everyone else that knows that it's football, not soccer. But we're having a blast. That was just a digression. But we have also learned the rituals of discarding waste. And sometimes my family and I, we do it with a chuckle. We do it with a glint in our eyes because we kind of know where this discarded material is heading. We know where it's heading. It's not going to a green emerald city, a place called Away, which is the most fastidious myth of modernity, that there is a land called Away, and you can just throw things there. I grew up in Away, if I'm to put that mildly. I grew up in Nigeria, and a little bit of Away was in our playgrounds, right? And we navigated those fields where we saw the subsidized righteousness of the global north spilling into our homes. And it's not that we condemned the people in the north. It was that we kind of understood that there was nothing else to do. What do you do with your trash? You throw it away. It's just that Away often looks like where I come from. Millions and millions of tons of plastic are often tossed to Ghana, for instance, under the name of fashion sustainability, right? 15 million pieces of discardable material goes to Ghana and becomes this sweltering heap of righteousness that the people in Ghana don't know what to do with, right? And it becomes illegally dumped. But do you stop throwing your trash because of that? No, there's nothing else you can do. You're caught in a moral order that has an imperative that that's the only way you can act. You act with the major, with the categorical. We need to save the planet. It's just that the planet is a lot bigger than you think, right? Including our politics. It's wilder, more promiscuous than your accounts of arrival and victory. I heard a story of a man called Ibn Harlow. Ibn Harlow is a South African military contractor. He works with governments in this paramilitary arrangement to supply soldiers to governments in Africa. And he's a pioneer in this field. One time, during the Boko Haram crisis, everyone remembers that, bring back our girls, right? 200 and something girls, 270 something girls were kidnapped in the middle of the night and were lost, and the whole world, in a moment of hallelujah, just said, no, we will not have this. You bring back our girls. Everyone remembers Michelle Obama holding that sign, right, in the White House, bring back our girls. Ibn Harlow was the spear of this righteous action, right? So he was commissioned to help Nigeria to do this. So he came with his men, and he trained our men, and they went out to look for Boko Haram, the terrorist group. And they went and they trained, and it was like a movie, and they did all of that, and they were just about to get to the act when Ibn Harlow received a phone call. And he confessed this on Al Jazeera. And Ibn Harlow said, I received a call from a government saying that we should stop with the efforts to retrieve the girls because it was politically inconvenient to do so. You see, this state government was in cahoots with the government to come in the Nigerian elections. They wanted a new kind of government, and they felt it might be giving too much political currency to the government in place, the incumbent government, if they found the girls. So they called and said, "Cease, stop this." And when this journalist asked Ibn Halo, who's an old man, who did this? He said, the United States. As you already kind of suspected, this wasn't a plot twist. It wasn't a plot twist of any kind. Now, this is not a demonization or pathologization. It's an invitation to be suspicious along with me and the trickster archetypes that are already in this room, that sometimes the way we respond to the crisis is the crisis. The righteousness, our notions of getting by or defeating the other, might just be how the system, the ecology, reinforces its hold, its stranglehold on our bodies. That morality is an ecology, and it contains hate as well. Trying to get rid of people who hate, the others who hate, so that we can be the shining light of love might be exactly how hate thrives. So instead of thinking about morality as something that is domiciled within human breasts and chests, it's an invitation to consider that we are not all that. We're not well put together either. To live in an entangled world is to appreciate that the world extends beyond and exceeds our notions of correctness. Is this a way of saying political difference doesn't matter? Obviously, it matters until it stops mattering in the way that we expect it to. One of the very hard lessons of African governments was realizing that when we chased away, which was a thing to do, I would have done the same thing. When we chased away our colonizers, we turned around and we saw that in our victory, we had become the people we chased away. We were stuck within the systems that we tried to get rid of. We chased them away and we said, yes, and we turned around and we saw a flag, a constitution, and comorbid relations with the IMF. And so we're stuck in our notions of victory and freedom that seem no longer to serve our best interests. So I'm here to speak not to you to dialogue even further. I'm not here to tell you, let's dialogue even more, because there's something very neurotypical about dialogue. About just let's sit down and we can trash it out together. I don't trust that process. I don't trust that too much. Okay, I've had, well, maybe another keynote or another talk would have me speaking about my work in the psychotherapy. But healing, emancipation doesn't come from the front. It comes from the sides. It comes from the places we're not expecting. It comes from autistic cartographies, where we stray away from the ways we're trained to move forward. I'm trying to say freedom isn't forward, it's awkward. It's not down the highway, it's off the highway. The highway no longer leads to places that are interesting. So if our politics is exclusively about defeating the other side, I fear that we will become the other side by and by. Because if you lean on a wall a long time, you become a wall. Our work is not to work through exits, or to champion new buildings, because even walls talk in Creole. Walls are not as stable as we think they are. Walls are migrant. Binaries are migrant. The world is too promiscuous to sit still in our notions of settlement. So in the idea, in the spirit of fugitivity, I invite you to know what our bodies already sense, our bones already sense, our ancestors already sense. If we are to find new ways of being alive in the world, we need a different kind of politics. We need a different notion of leadership. It can't be the man in the front any longer. It can't be the one who's walking, on the highway. We need a notion of leadership that breaks away from the highway. We need experiment. We need a carnival. We need dance. We need a diva. I can't do that voguing thing, but yes, voguing is philosophy. We need a notion of agency and accountability and responsibility that doesn't sit squarely within white modernity. And as I said last year, I will say it again right now, whiteness is not white people. I have to say this over and over again because I face a tide of a torrential, wave of imaginations that reduce whiteness to white people. Whiteness is not white people. Nigeria is the whitest nation on earth. It's 200 million black people caught up in white imaginaries about progress and time. We're constantly saying we need to catch up with New York. We need to look like London. We are white in that sense. And if whiteness is a part of the Anthropocene, if whiteness is a moral order, if whiteness is a political form of capture and captivity, then we need something different. And we cannot repeat the thesis of white modernity if we are to address decoloniality. So how do we decolonize? That's the question. We come to the summit of my talk, and I announce to you that I don't know. I don't know. I have no clue how we do this. I have no clue. But that's the point. If I had a clue, it might just be modernity repeating its thesis in my view of the future. I think the world is constantly inviting us to play. If I had a genie and a bottle or whatever genies come from, and I rubbed it, I would wish to know how to play again, like my children know how to do. Because play is the refusal of the world to be still. Play is always decolonial. Play is the refusal of standardization. If our politics does not resemble play, then we might be refusing the emancipatory gifts of our time. My son knows that a chair is a spaceship. He knows, he's not pretending, he knows that things are not just things, that they're relationships, that they're practices. He knows what Geena was talking about a while ago, that bodies cannot be categorical. Bodies are written in the lower case, not in the uppercase. Bodies are not categorical. Bodies spill. Bodies experiment. Read about virtual particles if you want to learn that boundaries are life-making events and death-making events. So my people, let's travel with the monstrous. Don't think about the monster as the evil, the Disney-esque horned beast that gets in the way and evokes repulsion. Think about the monster as how our cultures have always understood transformation. The monster is the thing that shows up and refuses our claims to finality. The monster is the world's way of saying there's still something else to do that you don't know anything about. You think you're final? You think you're done and fine and cool? No, there's something else. There's a fluidity that you know nothing about. How about you stay with the premise of the monstrous? If our politics was not just about inclusion is a form of violence too, right? Dragging people into gentrified spaces where they can be legible, it's fine, we need that, but it's still a form of violence. Is there something else? Darkness, light, and the other. Is there a Rumian field beyond wrongdoings and right doings? You all know Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet. Is there a field beyond good and evil, light and shadow, that we're all being called to? If there is, then I want to see you there. I want to play with you there, and dance with you there, and possibly vogue with you there. I just know that I'll meet you there. Thank you.
And that concludes our afternoon plenary. Up next, please join us in the hub for a poetry slam with Cali fellow Miroslava Herrera. Thank you.